Welcome, everyone. I'm extremely happy to be here with authors Chude-Sokei and Claudio Lomnitz. The title of this panel is All Our Intersections, Memoirs of Family and Odyssey. I want to thank the organizers of the festival for putting together this panel. My name is Emilio de Antuñano. I am a professor of history at Trinity University here in San Antonio, and I will be moderating the conversation and introducing our authors. So we are very honored to have with us Chude-Sokei, who is a writer, a scholar, and the director of the African American Studies program in Boston University. His writing on music, technology, and the African diaspora has appeared in many venues, and he has published 2 books on these topics. The Last Darky, Bert Williams' Black on Black Minstrelsy, and the African Diaspora, and The Sound of Culture, Diaspora and Black Technopoetics. Today he's here with us to talk about his latest book, which is a memoir entitled Floating in a Most Peculiar Way. It is named after a David Bowie song, for those of you who were wondering where the title came from. Claudio Lomnitz is an anthropologist, a historian, and a critic who works broadly on Latin American culture and politics. He's a professor of anthropology at Columbia University, and he has written many books. I will not name them all, but among them is Death and the Idea of Mexico, and The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón. I give a shout out to the return of Comrade Flores Magón because it is set in the borderlands, and we are here in San Antonio. So I think our listeners from San Antonio will enjoy it particularly. His latest book is titled Nuestra América, My Family in the Vertigo of Translation. These are the 2 books. And by the way, you can purchase both books from Nowhere Bookshop, which is our festival's official bookseller. You can just click on Buy the button, and you will be able to purchase them. So, Luis and Claudio, it has been a true pleasure to read your books. I think they speak beautifully with each other, and I think that surprisingly they tell very similar stories. Luis, your book is a memoir that follows your birth in present-day Nigeria, even though you were born in the short-lived Republic of Biafra, actually on the day when the civil war in Nigeria begins. So your book tells the story of your childhood in Jamaica and your move to the US as a teenager in the 1980s. So it is a book that covers Nigeria, Jamaica, and the US. Your book also tells the story of your mother, who was born in Jamaica, and your father, who was an important political and military figure in the Republic of Biafra, and who was killed very young when you were a young baby. Claudio, yours is a book that is more about your family than about yourself. You write about many family members, but mostly about your maternal grandparents who came from Eastern Europe, from the borderlands between the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Your grandparents came to America in the early 20th century, fleeing anti-Semitism. You were born in Santiago because your parents and your grandparents had made a life, in Latin America, in Peru, in Colombia, and in Chile. So both your books then talk about the African and the Jewish diaspora communities in the Americas. They talk about immigrants and refugees who came to the New World fleeing the violence of Africa and Europe. So this is what the books are about. And to get the conversation started, I wanted to ask you a very simple and perhaps generic question, and that is, why did you write these books? The question is generic, but I ask it because writing these books has forced you to revisit and research histories, the Nigerian Civil War, the Holocaust, that really hurt and touch your families. And the reason why I ask this question is that you did not really have to write these books. Luis, you write very interestingly that by becoming an American, you earned an enviable right, the right to forget Nigeria completely. And Claudio, you refer in your book very movingly about your grandparents and your great-grandparents. You talk about them as column-like figures, figures who, in a way, have shielded you or have acted as buffers you that protected you and your parents from the trauma of anti-Semitism and of the Holocaust. So you both were, in different ways, I think, protected from a past of violence. And the fact that you grew up, in a way, protected from these memories elicits the question of why have you chosen to write about them? So I wanted to start with that. Very open. I don't know who wants to go first, Claudio or Luis.
Luis, do you want to?
Luis.
Sure. Thank you, Emilio, for that question. And Claudio, honor and a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for being on this panel. And for this panel, I think the existence of this panel is speaking to conversations that need to be had about multiple diasporas. One of the things about diasporas that's so important is that all diasporas intersect. and we're in, and that's really, I think, representative of our historical moment. In fact, to answer the question, one of the reasons that I felt the need to write the story, one of the many reasons, is because diasporas all intersect. And we are at a time historically when displaced people and migrant peoples and people who were born in other countries, those numbers are staggering across the planet. And that's a very important universal story right now. I joke that the day is going to come soon when the number of people who live where they were born is going to be very small. Right. So I wanted to tell that story of diaspora and migration, but also in the context of the Black world and African American culture, which, although it has its own forced migration from slavery, it also has voluntary migration, certainly since the 1960s. And we've had more Africans coming to the United States since the 60s, and certainly in the last few decades, than the amount that came through the slave trade. It's an enormous change in what Black identity and Black culture means, though we don't register it. We tend to think of African American culture as almost kind of culturally static. And when I say we, I mean white and Black America thinks of Black culture as static. And, you know, it's important to me to tell the story of, if in fact America is becoming less white and browner by 2050 or whatever that date is, Black America is becoming less traditionally Black also because of all of these immigrants coming from the Spanish-speaking world and from African continent. So that's the broader intellectual and political context for me telling the story. The personal context is my mother, who passed away in 2005 and who's a central figure and a central absence in the story. All my life, she knew that her personal story was an epic one. She knew it was a big story. It was Jamaica, it was post-war Britain, it was migration to England, what they call the Windrush generation, the first generation of Black migrants to the colonial motherland after World War II. My father's story, the Biafra movement, the independence of Nigeria, the genocide of the Igbos. My mother carried all of that in her mind, and knowing that it was a story worth telling, the convergence of all these different stories. And I think I was raised with the assumption that I would be the one to tell the story. It was convenient for her that I became a scholar and a writer because there was someone there to tell that story. The struggle for me was to figure out how to do it, which took quite a while. So realizing that my personal story could also speak to these broader cultural shifts and transformation was a real obligation to me, and a kind of a mission for me for many years. Also, there's the fact that I may be a scholar, but I've always thought of myself as a writer. For me, scholarship and academic work are genres of nonfiction. And so I don't think a memoir, however personal, was really far off from those broader research oriented materials.
Thank
Well, first I wanted to thank Louis for having this conversation. I didn't know your work, Louis, before, and your book is extremely enthralling, interesting, and full of vistas about the complexity of movement. And about the complexity of movement into the identitarian categories of the U.S. that I found, as myself a migrant to the U.S., that I found extremely enlightening and plus, drawing to read. So it's a privilege to be here in this conversation. And thank you, Emilio, for taking the work of reading these books and organizing this conversation. My only criticism of you right now, Emilio, is that you said that you were starting with an easy question, and then the question is, why'd you write the book? If that's an easy question, I don't want to listen to the hard ones, because I think that many of us, certainly it's my case, writing is kind of mysterious, and why one takes these things up and when one takes up these projects, when they actually surface, is actually, to me, mysterious, and it's a hard question for me to answer. I mean, one of the, for instance, just to try to explain why, I was always interested in my maternal family's history, or I don't know about always, but a long time back, maybe about 20 years ago, I taped interviews with my mother and with my uncles, and then once I taped them, I decided I didn't really know that I wanted to write anything about it. I was glad to preserve the material, but I wasn't so sure that I would write about it. And I started writing this book at a particular point in my life, and relatively shortly after my father's death, which I think those kinds of moments are not unusual in terms of sparking the desire to reflect on one's own story, but also in part I wrote it, I think, because one of the mysteries guiding my writing of this book, which, as you said, ends during my childhood, is not the story of my own life, except refracted in the story of my family. One of the mysteries was, how was it possible that, coming from a story that is as full of hardships and difficulties and tragedies, actually, as my family history is in many points, it's also full of a lot of joys. I don't mean to just cast it in a tragic vein, but there is a lot of hardship in this story. How is it possible that I had like quite an enchanted childhood? What went into that? What you mentioned, Emilio, about column-like figures, that is, figures who were buffering the stories, mediating between a lived experience and what they wanted, for the future, is an important part of how that was achieved. So in that sense, silence appears to be as a gift. And then your question turns out almost to be a malicious one. That is, I'm betraying that gift because I'm exposing a story that so many people worked so hard to cover up. But I think that there's something to that point of view, by the way. But I think too that the production of oblivion, of forgetting, and which is in many ways often a gift, but although sometimes involuntary, sometimes deliberate, it also has its, like so many gifts, has its own poison, and so at a certain point in my life, I thought, well, if I don't write this story, nobody will, and that sense, it has some commonality with what Lewis just said. Maybe a little bit. I didn't feel like I was charged exactly by anyone to do it so much. I didn't have that historic weight. I think that Lewis has just expressed, but I did have the certainty that if I didn't write it, nobody would.
Yeah, it was a malicious question in a way. It wasn't my intention, but it was in a way. And when you're talking about the gift of silence, but of course the losses that silence imposes on us. I think one of the more eloquent examples that your book describes is the fact that your father knew 6 or 7 languages, and your great-grandfather knew over 10 languages, and you speak, I think, 4 languages. But the fact that you do not know German or Russian, this is, in a way, one of the losses that this oblivion has imposed on you. So I think that the language part really reflects the idea that you are mentioning right now.
And I saw that in Lewis's book, actually, except that Lewis had the courage to go back to his home, to his homeland, which you didn't know, you knew whatever that you were born in, but that you'd never lived in. But that problem of language loss, which I think is central to many diaspora stories, and certainly central to mine. I mean, yeah, my family lost. I lost before. I was never taught half of the languages that I needed to write this book.
So I'm thinking that the vertigo of translation, which of course is the subtitle, one of the things I appreciated and feel in common with is not so much the linguistic, well, yes, the linguistic, not so much languages, but what's focused on in my book is dialects, right? The changing of dialects. And the question of loss for me in the memoir is, and the loss that you impose on yourself as you try to assimilate in different cultures and different dialects, right? I was very clear in the book that as a young man, you don't have this political choice between, do you want to speak in the Jamaican dialect or an African American vernacular, or speak in Igbo, or speak in, no, you want to speak the language of the dominant group that you are assimilating into. And the good thing about telling a story from the perspective of a child is it's hard to judge a child for making the convenient political choices. Right? And so the loss of dialect throughout the narrative and the sensitivity to changing dialect for me is really how assimilation has worked as my family and me migrated across the Atlantic. As I even talk about how my mother spoke in a very strong British accent, but that British accent she spoke in came from being a colonial, not from being British. Right. So the dispersal of dialects for me said something about how this particular diaspora operates.
Yeah, Luis, as Claudio, I read your book as I'm Mexican and I'm an immigrant in the U.S. and the politics and the conflicts that you describe between African Americans and Africans, while not completely similar, they made me understand a lot better my place in this country, where there is, of course, a long history of Mexican migrations. And I think your book really made me understand how, ethnicity and race and identity in America are always being transformed in so many. It is such a creative space where these ethnicities and languages and identity are always in the process of being remade and remade and remade. So as you say, starting with the 1960s and with the arrival of migrants from Africa, from Asia, and from many other places, the initial categories in the US of black and white, their meanings are changing.
Yes, indeed.
I was struck by you explained very eloquently how when you came to America, you had to define an identity, not vis-a-vis white America, but vis-a-vis African Americans. And this is perhaps the central conflict in your book. And I think one episode that encapsulates this challenge is the fact that, as the title of your memoir makes clear, you have always loved David Bowie, and this is a music that has accompanied you your whole life. But when you arrive to the US, you find out that David Bowie is white music. So if you want to be a Black American, David Bowie, that implies turning your back away from David Bowie. So maybe you can tell us a little bit how you reconcile this Blackness with this love for Bowie, or how did you reconcile it, if you ever were able of reconciling it?
Well, in some ways, the ultimate reconciliation comes by daring to call the memoir a Bowie title, and all of the chapters in the book being Bowie title. That's kind of a declarative statement of possession of this thing that is not supposed to be mine because of someone else's understanding of race. The true story, though, I mean, there's a historical basis to it, as you might know. The legend in my family is that when we were in the refugee camps in Gabon, that's when I first heard David Bowie's music, at least the song Space Oddity. According to family legend, of course, I'm too young to know if this is true or not. And as Claudio can tell you, family legends can go either way, right? They may be authentic, but that doesn't mean they are true. But the family legend was that that song was heard by me in the refugee camp, and my mother and my aunts, as I grew up, what they remembered of the song was what they would sing to me and soothe me to sleep as a child. All I know is that when I arrived in Jamaica and in the United States, I was always on the lookout, or at least whenever I would hear that song or that person's voice, it did something to me. So there's some kind of truth to my relationship to Bowie. But as I got older, Bowie became the conduit to lots of things. He authorized my interest in science fiction. Some of the books and ideas he referred to led me out of any kind of racial cul-de-sac that I was in that said Black people should read this and you should listen to this, etc. Bowie just became the representative of a general sense that the world was mine, regardless of the imposed political, racial, or economic categories. Because when we arrived in the United States, we arrived in quote unquote the ghetto, and we were socioeconomically quite limited. So Bowie was a sign of possibility always. And even though years passed when I would diminish the significance of David Bowie, to be honest to my childhood and to the formation of my intellect, without David Bowie, there would have been no Frantz Fanon or Aimé Césaire or W.E.B. Du Bois. It's all a part of the stew that made me intellectually. And so, to be honest to that growth of my mind and my imagination, I have to declare, yes, I fought for this knowledge and for this this possession of David Bowie, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form going to abandon it at this point.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to add something, Claudio, or I can ask another question to continue.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you mentioned, Emilio, in relation to Lewis's book that I agree with is that it does, if from a Mexican American point of view, provides a very interesting read from that angle. I know that when I moved from Mexico to the U.S., which was 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago, even though I wasn't myself a Mexican, I wasn't born in Mexico, I was raised there in Mexico City. I did have a fear of assimilation that you find in Lewis's book. That is a very ambivalent connection to the idea of becoming American, and even worse, of my children becoming kind of Mexican Americans or Latinos or something like some American identitarian category, frankly, scared me and was not at all appealing to me. And it took me a long, long time to begin to really to assimilate various kinds of minoritarian categories that may or may not have been applied either to me or more likely to my kids. Yeah. And to deal with them in a way that wasn't exclusively defensive. And I think that that's maybe that's part of what Lewis, you were talking about a second ago in terms of the significance of dialect versus language, since the dialect in the end involves accent, and it also involves the possibility of passing or not, of maintaining a distinction, of maintaining a difference, or of of assimilation or apparent assimilation. And that's, of course, a classical, first of all, it's a classical Jewish problem, and I know it's a classical Black problem, although in a very different way. And one of the things that I was thinking about in connection to our books and their connections is that the story of my maternal grandparents emigrate separately. They meet in Lima, in Peru, in the 1920s. And that immigration, in some way, has a almost inverted dimension to what was in your book, Lewis, about your migration from Jamaica to the U.S., which is that for example, my grandfather came from a situation of intense discrimination toward Jews in the area that he lived in, which when he left the region that he was from, Bessarabia, had been incorporated into Romania. So it's one of those places where he moved countries without moving from his hometown. Right? His hometown changed political adscriptions, and he left Romania at a time of quite and strongly intensifying anti-Semitism. Arrives to Peru, where in Peru he's a European. I mean, yes, he's Jewish. They did, the category Jewish existed, and it was not unknown. But it was such a minoritarian category. People didn't really, it was more almost like a mythical category. Whatever, Christ killers or Jews from Catholic mythology, but not really a known kind of a person. And in terms of how they would be assimilated on the street, they would be assimilated on the street with being European. So he went from a situation of very low status to a comparatively privileged position in the migration to the Americas. Whereas what you describe in the end is a situation where the African, all of the distinction that came to you from your African family, which is very substantial actually, in some ways is stripped of significance, at least in the beginning. And I think that speaks to the position of Europe and the European white, Black in the Americas in a very potent way, I thought.
It also speaks to one of the things that happens to many immigrants. It's called status drop, which you lose status in arriving to the United States in many cases, certainly not all of them, but in many cases. And then that plays itself out in your relationship to the new ascriptions, right? The new identity that you're assumed to be, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things you see in the memoir, and I know you relate to this from yours, is just changing notions of privilege over time and space. And one thing I really appreciate in your book, I read it and I understand it, but I wonder how people who have very stable notions of identity over time respond to our narratives, because if you think about it, it can be dizzying to people who have a kind of stable sense of racial or cultural identity, and they're looking at yours and there's so many mixtures, etc. But it's not dizzying to those of us who occupy those identities. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does to me. It does to me. And but I think I don't know how whether you feel this, but I think what's one of the things that seems to me to be interesting too is that movement through places and times and places also presents different alternatives to different people in the same family.
Oh, absolutely.
No?
Yes.
And so some of those decisions, like what your discussion right now about David Bowie, which to me, by the way, it's something I'd like us to talk about. I don't know whether you'd want to talk about it at some point, but the question of your name that comes up at the end of your book, right? Which in the end is in some way connected to the way in which you've chosen to what you make Bowie stand for, because he's standing for a lot there, no? I think that those are, to my mind, very courageous kinds of stances, but not everybody necessarily, even in the same family or group, takes the same route. And in that sense, I think these stories, these memoirs are important because there's a kind of particularity.
Absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of the memoir form. For those of us who have done research for years and scholarship, we could, as you do, and as I certainly do, we can pose broader political and ideological conflicts in society, particularly around race or Black identity or immigration, around a dinner table or in terms of the relationship between your uncles versus your aunts, etc. I found that really helpful because not only is it true to the experience of having a broad migrant family, right? It also helps us convey the conversations that could be fracturing and tense for most people, but rendering it in a familial context, so it seems almost intimate. At least that's what I found helpful to do, right? That's why the memoir form really worked for me.
And I think even though the histories of your families, they are very unique, and there is something dissing about this vortex of names and ancestors and stories. But as you mentioned, Luis, the U.S., or I mean, I'm talking more about the U.S. now than Latin America, but the stories are less and less exceptional in a way. And if you think about, if you scratch a little bit in the stories, well, you're talking about the colonization, the ending of European empires. Like it's a very universal story because it is shaped by the history of the 20th century. So I think many readers in the US today, or in the New World more broadly, I think it will also be easy to identify with many of these stories, or perhaps to go back and do some work ourselves in our own families, because many of these stories are maybe hidden or forgotten or silenced, as Claudio says. So I think these are very, while unique, still very universal and increasingly common stories.
Well, I have to say, one of the things about the experience of getting this story told is that even though it's freshly in the world, it just came out 2 months ago or so, I just feel like I'm automatically having a conversation, not just Black America, but with immigrants and displaced people and migrants. And I really feel like the story, although it can be overdetermined by American racial relationships, that would be a mistake. It would be a mistake to not see Claudio's story and mine as being in the same conversation. It would be a mistake to not see, our conversations with immigrant writers and people who are products of this changing world stage that's reimagining race and ethnicity all over the planet. I think I'm writing more to that than I'm writing specifically to a particularized Black or African intellectual or political trajectory. So yeah, I think that as I write this memoir, I feel, this isn't as unique as it seems. But the fact that some might think so suggests that we need to do some work to have people realize that, this is actually the new common narrative for most of us. That's what I love reading. When I reading Claudio's book, it's like, I so relate to folks not only crossing borders, right, but also people just being in themselves. So I hesitate to use the word cosmopolitan because as an academic, that word has come under a lot of criticism lately, I know, right? But there is just this real ease that comes from relentless migration and travel. Yes, there's trauma. Yes, there's violence, but there is an ease that I think represents the way the world operates now. I always try to remind my students that even though Claudio's stories and mine, for example, could be seen as stories of people who come from privilege, and they lose privilege and they gain it, and there's some, even on the ground level of low wage labor, there is an endless border crossing that creates different kinds of sensibilities that represent, I think, where we are historically.
My impression, and this is not so much from my own biography, but from the work that I did, the book that Emilio mentioned before on this Mexican anarchist movement and collaboration between Mexicans and Americans around the Mexican Revolution, is that peasant and working class migrations, at least from Mexico to the U.S., generated their own kind of cosmopolitanism that, in fact, was very hard to assimilate back in Mexico. That is, for example, this was an anarchist movement of Flores Magons or a revolutionary movement in the beginning of the 1900s that was allied in the U.S., had it with socialists or with the Wobblies, that in Mexico, in the end, couldn't be very easily assimilated except as a kind of within the traditional nationalist language. And so I think that the problem that you're talking about is general to histories of diaspora migration, the learning processes that go along with migration, even migration inside a country, not necessarily even international. Generates forms, I think, of knowledge and understanding that don't always have resonance wherever it is that people used to call home, And so there is a kind of displacement there, and a critical, to my mind, a kind of critical capacity that comes with that movement that one hopes is going to be allowed to have its say rather than to be silenced by whatever the dominant form is that is constantly translating those experiences. In the case of Mexico, which has such a huge immigrant population and story of immigration especially into this country, also such a huge history in this country before it was this country. In the levels of silencing of those experiences in Mexico, in the Mexican press, in Mexican politics, in Mexican representation, it have been staggering. I mean, just staggering. So in that sense, I think talking about these migratory biographies, even though it sometimes may sound a little pretentious, because in fact, the movement generates knowledge and the knowledge can sound pretentious. But I think it's of critical importance, not only for the people who experience this kind of thing, but for the people who haven't and who sometimes feel distanced from family members or friends who have. And that distance needs to be breached, I think.
And this breaching, Claudia, goes back to your point about, the secret that we're revealing, right? As I put it in a certain section in the book, where I say that I feel like I'm always snitching out my homies, because there's a scene where I'm accused of doing just that. And when I wrote that, I was thinking of all people, I was thinking of Joan Didion when she said that writers are always selling someone out. I think that these kinds of stories that destabilize conventional racial and identitarian narratives are always going to be seen as snitching. Right? So there is a kind of danger, I think, to that.
And a kind of courage, I think, which I think is also there in your writing, the kind of courage that I think is necessary to do this. One of the things around this issue that has to do, I think, with something that Emilio was raising about the particularities of each of our stories, that I don't know whether it's something you've thought about, Louis, but that I did think about some, is that the brushes in my family history with greatness or with fame, either with personal fame or with having been present at famous times. Like, for example, the first photo of my grandfather that is that I have that is in the book is on the day of his bar mitzvah, which were at that time those were collective events. So let's say the whole school generation went through it at the same time. It wasn't like the individual events that we have now. So the dedication on the back, it's December 1917, Odessa, right? So in other words, this photo is coming right from the middle of the Russian Revolution. In other words, right? Or so in that case, it's like a luminous moment where that I had to write about, or else my grandparents, these maternal grandparents, were very close to this very important figure in Latin American cultural history, José Carlos Mariátegui, who was, a famous Marxist and the founder of a socialist party and the founder of a very important modernist journal. And I found that when I was writing about those kinds of things, connections with very famous people, which in my family appear actually quite a lot. There's, Pablo Neruda or Mariátegui, or a number of people who may not be that famous in the US, but are very famous in Latin America. I actually found it hard to write about those things because they were so luminous to me, like they were in some way dazzling to me. God, I have to think about the Russian Revolution, for God's sake, or I have to really sit down and rethink about Mariátegui and why they might have been friends, why they might have been close. And you have that in your story as well. And I was kind of wondering about that, since in your case, I have the impression that there's actually a lot of freight. I mean, there is a lot of expectation around you, and so when you say there's betrayal, there's, which I think there is betrayal on all of us who write.
Absolutely.
Must betray, but in your case, I thought, wow, I mean, that's a heavy expectation. I mean, in some way. So I wonder how you, I mean, because when you write about your return to Nigeria, or not, I mean, it is a return, but it's also a first time at the same time. There's that disjoint between your own appreciation and of what's happening and this freight. And I think that anyone who writes about either their family or themselves or both has to deal with that.
Well, thank you for opening up that direction of conversation. There was a consciousness on my part of narrating something that I've always noticed as an immigrant. I've always found it poetic that the person driving the cab used to be a major political figure in their own country. I've always found it interesting that the woman running the dry cleaners on the corner was once a major journalist in her own country, right? It's status drop for many immigrants, but there is a sense in which for a lot of us who come from political and cultural luminosity, to use the term that you used, right? In my case, my father was one of the leaders of the Biafra movement, and my godfather was the actual leader of the Biafra movement. And in the Black world, in the African world, he is, held up there with, some of the most major figures. My godfather is seen as being on par with Patrice Lumumba and people like that, right? Not so much in America, but outside of the United States. But if you remember, there's a section towards the end when he does come to Los Angeles, and I describe him as he's wearing sandals. He's just like an uncle coming to sunny California. That's a part of this narrative where people, I think, aren't necessarily betraying that, but to become an American is really to be stripped of all of those things. And it's seen as betrayal, but part of either the democratizing process or the process of assimilation or just what it's like to live in America, you may come from these powerful political sort of historical classes or backgrounds or spaces, but the process by which you become America kind of strips you of those things, and you just become the guy in sandals driving a taxi cab or running a dry cleaner. And for me, there's something poetic but also sad about that. So I'm glad you picked that up, but that was a deliberate part of the narrative, which is why on the one hand it's cast as betrayal of this legacy. On the other hand, it's America, which is like, legacies are not supposed to matter. And so it's a combination of selling people out and betrayal, but also just a painful understanding that part of the process by which we become Americans is to sort of strip ourselves of some of those narratives and just become mundane.
Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting because, of course, from the viewpoint of Mexico, the more I think general narrative of migration and reality of migration is that the migration of many generations of Mexicans to the U.S. while facing discrimination in the U.S. is a place that in many ways has been much more generous than Mexico, and where Mexicans have experienced a social mobility that was oftentimes would have been impossible for, in Mexico. So this is very interesting what you are describing, Luis. We will soon have a few questions from the audience coming in. Claudio, there was a question for you that I wanted to ask, and it's going back to the language question. You wrote this book in Spanish originally, and then you had to rewrite it in English with the help of a translator. But it's very much your book both in English and in Spanish. And I think that you in the US you have an audience as a scholar, but then in Mexico you have a different audience perhaps because you write in Mexico in the press and in journals that are a lot of people read. So it seems to me that in Mexico you have a certain place as a writer of sorts, and it's a different one in the US. And I was wondering, how does your book change when it is written in English, and how do English readers in the US or in Britain or elsewhere, what type of book are they reading that is different? And I don't know how this connects about the difference between the US and Latin America or the New World, that perhaps is a good category. But I wanted to hear a bit more about these translation issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue for me. It's always been a big issue because I'm mainly bilingual between Spanish and English, and those are the only two languages that I write in. But I have a kind of insecurity in both to some extent, and also a love for each of them. When I wrote the book, I decided to write it in Spanish because. And it was the first book that I wrote in Spanish for some book. I had written several my previous, several books have been in English, written in English. But I decided to write it in Spanish because, to me, Spanish is the language of the home. It's my first language, and I figured that the book had a kind of intimacy that I could best express with that language. Also, which in thinking about the story, my grandparents' story, I thought that to me Spanish was, let's say, the equivalent of their Yiddish, and English was more like the equivalent of Esperanto, which was created, by an Eastern European Jew in the late 19th century with the hope of gaining some universal purchase, and English has a kind of universal purchase. I thought that my grandparents' story means more, or meant more, would mean more, especially in South America, also in Mexico, but more in South America than it would in English. I wasn't sure that there would be interest in English, to be honest. And then some friends of mine, after it came out, said, you should get it into English. I commissioned a translation to be able to show it to publishers, and when a publisher was interested, I rewrote, and I deeply rewrote the book. In part, it's rewritten because once you write a book, new information comes out. That's always the case. The book has a kind of performative effect, which means that stuff that you didn't know when you wrote it, you know after you wrote it. And so there's new stuff that exists in the English language book that doesn't exist in the Spanish language book. That's thanks to many collaborations, people writing to me to give me information that I hadn't had, or that emerged after the publication of the book in Spanish. But I think that there's also, it's just a different language. And in some ways, I think that the English to me is, first of all, it has to be a little bit more explicit, a little bit more analytical. And the Spanish is a little more poetic, a little bit more evocative. So there are those kinds of differences as well. I had to, I think, explain more about the South American dimension of the book for English than I had to explain in Spanish. And I had to explain a little bit more about the Jewish stuff for the Spanish than I did for the English, because I think in English, sort of the broader Jewish history is better known than it is in the Spanish world. So there are both content differences, but there's also a kind of texture and the books are actually different.
So can I sneak in a quick question? I know we have got other things going on, but so Claudio, do you see yourself as having written 2 memoirs?
I sort of do. Not entirely 2, but I see the second one, which was the one in English, as a further evolution of the first.
Ah, okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Actually, if we have a couple of questions from the audience, but speaking about just the genre of memoirs, we have an audience member who asks both of you, what were some of the memoirs that you read that stuck with you and that perhaps were like a model for this, for your books?
I didn't have a much of a model for the book, honestly. The book has a very, I think, peculiar structure that I developed in the writing, but to me, one of the memoirs that interested me was Stefan Zweig's a book about the world. What is it? The world that was lost, or I can't remember. The book that he wrote shortly before committing suicide in Brazil. That is a Europe that was gone, that no longer existed, and without which his life didn't make sense entirely, too much sense. And it was, well, first of all, it's a great book, but second, it was interesting to me because in part, my grandparents did not take that route. They weren't as successful as Zweig was in Europe. That's also true. But in one of the things that interested me about my story was how they had latched on to America. America understood as something that spans the Americas, and how America needed to be invented for them. They needed to invest themselves fully in that project. Whereas Zweig, who loved Brazil, and his wife both committed, suicide together because they just couldn't go on. And so there's something about that memoir that affected me.
I'll throw out some names, but like Claudio, I don't think there was a direct model for this, because one thing I wanted to do with it was to signal, perhaps pretentiously, my literary ambitions, rather than stick with any kind of mainstream formal memoir. Dealing with publishers, for example, there are those who are more interested in story than writing, and then there are those who are more interested in writing than story. Finding a blend was a bit of a challenge. But so in terms of my memoir, I won't really refer to any specific models. However, I will mention a couple of memoirs that when I think memoirs, they come to my mind in terms of what I've always had as a reference point. And Nabokov's Speak Memory always comes to mind, not as something that I would imitate, certainly, but it comes to mind as perhaps one of the first memoirs that made me think of the memoir as a literary form. Jamaica Kincaid's memoirish works have always been really interesting to me. Her insistence on a kind of brutal honesty, but also a distance from it. Edward Said's memoir, I thought, was very important for me to understand as we think of a reshaped world in the wake of colonialism, and as a scholar who studies colonialism, to write about one's own personal experience with that. So those are books that come immediately to mind.
I should say that the person asked about the memoirs that stuck with you, and I was the one who added the model thing. That I think neither of you had actually the model, so that was on me. Claudio, your book remembered me a lot of a book that I read a couple of years ago, which is called. It was published in French, but title is the history of the grandparents that I never met. L'histoire des grands-parents que j'ai pas eu. And he talks about, Ivan Jablonka is the author.
Jablonka, yeah.
A really beautiful book, and I think it made me, I saw a lot of connections between this book and yours. Friends, we have a couple of minutes, and I wonder if we'll have to close in a couple of minutes, but I want to give you just a chance to.
Well, Claudio mentioned he wanted to talk about Bowie really quickly. Was there something specific about Bowie you wanted to mention?
No. I just thought that what he does in the book is at a certain point it's Bowie, but at a certain point it just seemed to me that it was a placeholder for something that you then identify with your name, with your true name, which is the ability to speak occasionally, the name is that, but occasionally against the people, or despite. I understood the name as actually being more about the ability to speak despite the people, not against the people. But there was some ambivalence there, and it seemed to me that that Bowie was in some way serving to as a specific instantiation of this, because in the end, what fascinates us, that's how I read, what fascinates us, what we cathect onto, what we love, or where our desire is not so easily governed,
by expectations or ideologies, racial or otherwise. And you're absolutely right that Bowie sort of authorized this, not just a defiant outsiderness, but as I point out, it's the alien who refuses to assimilate. It's the spaceman who refuses to come down, and who decides that floating is actually better than landing. And so that certainly works for me throughout the memoir. And it does address exactly what you're pointing out. And the name, the discovery of the true name at the end of the memoir, is absolutely in sync with that. So thank you for seeing that connection.
Friends, I'm going to end the conversation in authoritarian fashion, but thank you so much, Claudio and Luis, for joining us. It was so wonderful listening to you, and thank you for the audience for listening to us. The two books are wonderful, so if you want to purchase them, they are available. And yeah, it was great meeting you both and talking with you. So thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Me too. Thank you so much, and for doing this. Thanks for the organizers, Louis. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Emilio.
I will stop this.